Hello and welcome everybody to our short lecture series on how to write an EcoS term paper or master's thesis. Today we will start by talking about the basic structure of those two works that you have to produce, and I will also include a few introductory remarks on the difference between, for example, research and reporting and much more. So here you see the overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, the question, why do we bother about structure at all? Then, as I already mentioned, journalist reporting versus academic research. What are similarities and differences here? I think this is really important for you to understand what we require you to do as scholars. I will try to provide a few examples to kind of illustrate the whole thing and make it more tangible. Then we will have an overview of the basic structure of term papers and master's thesis. This is something that will be a recurring theme in the other presentations that will also follow in this lecture series. And then finally, the question, do you really have to structure all your research like this? And the answer is complicated, but you will see. Well, first of all, why should we actually bother about structure at all? Well, first of all, the thing is that this task that we're talking about, a term paper, and even more so, of course, a master's thesis, not to mention a PhD thesis, is a very complex task. It's not something that you can do like this. It's not something that you can write on 1 day or on 2 days or on 3 days. So usually it will not fit into your short-term memory. It's a long-term endeavor. Compare it to a marathon, or actually I would like to compare it more to a Camino de Santiago, like a journey, you take like 900 kilometers or even a trip around the world. It's something that really needs to be planned ahead so that you know, okay, this is what I'm going to do today, this is what I'm going to do tomorrow, this is what I'm going to need because I travel to different time zones. Or if you go back to a marathon, I better save my energy at the beginning because I really have to be able to survive those 42 point whatever kilometers that the whole thing is lasting. It's not a sprint, right? So it requires an idea what you have to expect, and also something like a plan how to deal with it. It is very easy when you write a term paper or a master's thesis or a PhD thesis to get lost in lots of data, information, ideas, approaches, or get overwhelmed again by a huge number of available data, conflicting information, different perspectives, different types of definitions that don't really fit, so you don't know what to do with it, and so on and so on. And the structure is really the thing that will help you to stay on track. It's like these little breadcrumbs in the fairy tale, right? You have to have a plan. Now, you know, myself having grown up in a planned economy, I know that plans have their limit. So your plan also, of course, has to be flexible, right? It's no problem to readjust the plan, but starting without a plan is really stupid. It's usually a waste of your time and energy. So in the best case, it's just a very inefficient way of achieving your goal. In the worst case, you will not reach your goal at all. So you have to plan ahead, and this plan is actually the structure. Every plan starts with a definition of your goals. Now, for your structure of your term paper or master's thesis, we call this your topic and your research question. We will talk about those components later in much more detail. The plan also invites a way to divide one huge task into many smaller tasks. And small means manageable, right? So something that, in the best case, you can actually accomplish on 1 day. This is how you can actually succeed. If you have a job that takes you like 50 work days, and you know exactly, that's what I'm going to do on day 1, that's what I'm going to do on day 2. In reality, it's not going to work out like this, in this type of precision, but in principle, this is what it is. So when you wake up in the morning, you don't have to think about this huge workload, which usually means that you actually don't want to get out of bed at all because it's so scary. It's like this big monster. But you think about your daily task. And if this is manageable, and manageable really depends on you. So the term manageable, or what is manageable, actually really differs from person to person, and that's something that you really have to find out individually. But in any case, you have to divide this big monster into smaller manageable tasks so that you can successfully divide it and then proceed and finish. That's, of course, the most important thing. A plan also includes ways to connect those pieces in a sensible way and in a transparent way. Sensible way means it has to make sense. Transparent means that actually people who are reading your work also should be able to understand what you are doing here, right? So they should be able to see, aha, now he or she did step number one. Okay, now comes step number two. I understand that there's a logical connection between the two. So this is also what the plan will help you. If you read a book, for example, by Kate Turabian, it's one of the many books out there on the market on, the writing of academic research. She calls that a storyboard. Storyboard means that you kind of outline the rough structure of your story, like like your life. You're born, you go to school, you work, you have a family, you retire, you die. Boom, that's your storyboard. And then you actually go further into the details when you actually complete this task. Obviously, it's a bit more complex. Now, having such a solid research structure or plan will help you to work towards your target. That sounds so self-evident, but very often the longer you work on something, it's really easy to get lost, to divert away from what you actually want to do. So you acquire all this exciting new knowledge, but then you figure out, oh, wait a second, but how do I now forcibly squeeze this into my term paper or master's thesis, which is not a good idea. You should always be driven by what you want to find and not by what you actually find. Then, yeah, as I already mentioned, dividing your research into manageable subtasks, daily task, weekly task, monthly goal, for example. And also, if you randomly or accidentally run into something interesting that you think, oh yeah, that is clearly relevant for my thesis, if you have a structure, you know where, in what part it could actually be relevant so that you can put it there or maybe save it for 2 weeks later when you arrive at that point. So you just make a note or save the file in a subfolder or however you organize yourself. So, this is really absolutely crucial. What I believe, and that's why I'm so enthusiastic about this, and that's why I will not really leave you alone until you all understood that, this skill is not something that only applies to a term paper or a master's thesis. It does actually apply to solving every single task, be it in your job, be it as scholars, be it in your personal life. It is always the same thing, and I will hopefully be able to explain and demonstrate that to you and convince you that I'm right by applying a few examples as I will do that later on. So just remember, the skill as such is something that is really enormously valuable, that doesn't have a half-life like data on GDP that 2 or 3 years from now will not be current anymore. That's something that is valuable for the rest of your life, and it is universally applicable to any challenge, to any task, to any complex problem that you have to solve. So really, it's worth your attention. It's really worth trying to understand that and to internalize it in a way, to make it part of your personality, make it part of your way to approaching the challenges that life will pose in front of you. Yeah, journalism. Academic research is in many ways actually similar to good journalism, in many ways, not completely. But there are also fundamental differences. Why am I saying this? Because I very often find that students, when they come to my program, they are good journalists without actually being aware of it or calling themselves as such, but they still need to become good scholars. Now, both journalists and scholars want to find something new and unknown, right? That's what they do. But there is one fundamental difference here, and I hope I'm not really offending any journalists, but that's at least how I understand it, and I have been working a lot with journalists throughout of my career, so I'm kind of certain that I'm right here. Anyway, what German journalists, no, what journalists, right? is often determined by what they find, by the evidence. I call it data-driven, right? They are mainly reporters. That's why you call them reporters, right? They're driven by the empirical side. They find some information and then they write about it, okay? Now, scholars do exactly the opposite. They are determined by what they are looking for. Remember, the plan, right? They are mainly researchers, not reporters. And they are driven by the methodology that they have chosen. So they are much more analytical, right? Journalists are more descriptive, not always, but the main part of what they do is to just tell you what they saw. Whereas scholars are more analytical. Not always, sometimes they describe what they see, but very often they try to answer a question according to a certain structure that enables them to be more certain about the quality of their answer. So scholars try to find what they write about. So if you write about topic A and you need data for that, first of all, you think about that topic and then you try to find the matching data. Not like you find data and then you think, oh, cool, I'm going to write about that. You know, that's a difference, a main difference, I think, between journalism and academic research. Now, this difference is reflected in the way how both groups of people approach their work. As a reporter, you would go to the field early, like the field in our case would be some country in East Asia, and then you collect. You know, hunter and gatherer is actually a phrase that a good colleague of mine in Duisburg had used many, many years ago. Hunter and gatherer, you go out there and you collect whatever you find, and you're really excited about it, right? And you put it in your bag, and then you write your story based on what you found. A scholar usually first spends lots of time in the library or wherever you work. I mean, it could be a virtual library like your computer at home, more or less the equivalent of that. You read what others have written on your topic, try to find out, you know, whether there is a gap in the literature, try to find out whether perhaps someone has already answered your question, because then it's really silly to try to answer it again, or maybe you then think you can answer it better anyway. And only then, in any case, after you know what's out there, on your specific field, on your specific research question or topic, then you start collecting data, also already having kind of an approach in mind so that you know what you're really looking for. So you collect data in a very purposeful way, like you already know what you're looking for. You're not going there and try to get whatever you can and later make sense of it. You try to make sense of a problem before and then get the matching data. I think I've said that now 3 or 4 times. But yeah, repetition, you know, is the mother of wisdom. So I hope you're listening to me still. Okay, now one example that is more related to East Asia. Let's call it the effects of sanctions on North Korea. That's your topic. And what would a reporter do? A reporter would go to North Korea very quickly and try to talk to whoever he can get hold of, and then complain that nobody's talking to him and that it's such a pain and that you can never travel anywhere freely. Would also include this in his report. But let's leave these things aside. Let's say this reporter is really lucky. He gets a chance to talk to state officials, talks to farmers who are affected by the sanctions, talks to middle-class people in the capital of North Korea who, you know, do trade, etc., and really suffer from sanctions on foreign trade. Talks to foreigners residing in Pyongyang who are usually regarded as experts because they have access to the country, unlike others. And actually, whoever randomly crosses his path, it might be me as well, because very often people also try to squeeze some knowledge out of myself on this kind of an issue. Then maybe this reporter would go to Washington and talk to Treasury Department officials. I've done that. It's actually quite exciting to see how these people think. It's very remarkable. Or you talk to a human rights organization in North Korea, in the US, or any other internationally based human rights organization that would tell you how people actually suffer from, you know, not being able to import key inputs, for example, for agriculture. And then, yeah, maybe also contacts experts. And well, I've written here, asked for their comments. I think journalists call that sound bites amongst each other. It's always nice having, you know, this line like Professor whatever from Austria said, and then you have half of a sentence, and that gives the whole report or article or whatever they call their product and kind of an authentic scent, right? But it won't really change the very message that they want to send, because this is really driven by the empirical data they found. Now, in the next paragraph, I have a researcher approaching the very same topic. Well, first of all, you would read about sanctions. And if you're a really good researcher, you would briefly forget about North Korea. You would try to find out whatever you can about sanctions. What is a sanction? How it is defined? How is this actually legally done? Who is able to issue sanctions based on what? You will find that there are bilateral sanctions and there are multilateral sanctions, and you have UN sanctions based on UN resolutions, or is it UN resolution, or is it UN Security Council resolution? And then you'll find a debate about the actual validity of those UN Security Council resolutions. And you will find a debate about how sanctions actually are a type of warfare, with non-military means, but still, you're trying to attack somebody in order to force this other side to comply with your own wishes, right? That sounds pretty much like war. There are scholars who actually say sanctions are similar to a medieval siege, where you surround the city and try to starve them so that they finally give up and open the gate, right? Then you identify as a researcher a sensible research question. That sensible means it should make sense, it should be of interest to somebody, right? Yeah, it should somehow relate to what has already been written on that whole topic, right? Then you search for ways to measure the effects of sanctions. If you want to write about this of sanctions effects, you have to somehow find ways to quantify them, right? Or you find they are not quantifiable, then you describe them in a qualitative way. But still, we are talking about measurement, right? So just saying that, people suffer, well, that's not completely wrong, but it's not scientific. As scholars, we want to know how much do they suffer? Can we somehow put a value to that? Can we compare this to other forms of suffering, etc., etc.? You could, for example, say, well, due to the reduction of oil imports, North Korean agriculture is 20% less productive than it used to be when they were able to use crude oil to produce chemical fertilizer in their factories along the East Coast, right? That would be something. And you learn about the pros and cons of various approaches to measuring sanctions, various approaches to quantifying sanctions. You will learn about debates in the field. Some of them I already mentioned. And then you will come up with a research plan and a set of criteria according to which you want to proceed. And only then this researcher would go to North Korea, Washington, and Vienna, and where else, to find information needed according to this analytical framework. So I think this just highlights that difference that I've discussed on the previous slide. So what's the outcome of all this? Now the reporter, after what he's done or she, writes a story about the people he or she met. You will really find this a lot in journalistic articles. They love to really go to very deep level of detail. Like, I talked to farmer Mr. Kim, and he said to me, right? A scholar would rarely do this, unless you really have a very detailed case study, but reporters really love that. As I have here on the slide, providing names for authenticity. Yes, it sounds more authentic, right? You, as a reader, you would instantly trust the journalist more, who can create the impression that, oh yeah, he's actually been there, he knows what he's talking about. Then you would talk about the effect, or write about the effects of sanctions that he could observe. I saw all these children, they were really skinny and really short, and if I compare that to South Korea, everyone is so much taller, so obviously people are really not eating enough, and I didn't see many cars on the street, so obviously they don't have much of fuel, etc., etc., and so on and so on. And then again, you would add a few sound bites by experts who are pro-sanctions and some who are anti-sanctions, so that you have kind of a balanced picture. You would perhaps ask me to say something, and I would say sanctions are stupid because they don't work. They are morally questionable because we are hurting the wrong people. And at the end of the day, we are also not really following up on our own values, etc., etc. And then he will perhaps ask another expert who will tell him, no, but look, this is a nuclear weapon state, and that's the only way how we can really tell them that we are unhappy. And at the end of the day, it's the Kim leadership that is starving its own population, not the sanctions. They just have to give up their nuclear program, and boom, all the sanctions will go. Since they choose not to give up their nuclear program, they are responsible for the consequences, and so on and so on. And maybe you find someone else who says, yes, and by the way, the UN should really conduct an impact analysis before issuing any sanctions. This is not being done. And then you get into some technical questions, but I don't think reporters would usually go further than that. He would then conclude by saying that, yes, indeed, you know, I've been there, I've seen it, people do really suffer. And then, yes, present those different explanations that I just mentioned to you. And we'll say that, yeah, but there's also sanctions evasion. Journalists love that topic. It sounds really like a thriller, you know, like secret operations and smuggling, and then clever journalists, you know, uncovering this and so on, because they're all looking for a scoop. This is what the journalists really aiming at, a scoop, that is, you know, being the first one to report on something important. Now, a researcher does something very different. A researcher would, in his paper or book, define a research question, which could, for example, be, do the effects of sanctions actually correspond with their goals? That's a good research question. And then you would list these goals, and actually you would provide evidence. You would say, okay, the American president, George W. Bush, has listed these 3 or 4 goals that he wants to achieve, or the UN Security Council has listed these and these goals that they want to achieve. And then you would discuss ways to measure the effects of sanctions in each area, as we already discussed before. Then the researcher would apply this analytical framework by collecting data, which might include a field trip to North Korea, but not necessarily, because there's this big question mark, how much can you learn from a field trip to a country where you can't really do appropriate research? And then this researcher would, after collecting data, return to his research question, answer it step by step using the evidence, and also following his analytical framework. Maybe then contact experts to see how they comment on these results. I actually strongly recommend this to my students, to have so-called expert interviews, especially if you do like a term paper or thesis, especially a master's thesis that is heavily based on secondary literature. It's always a good idea to have at least a few people confronted with what you found out and see what they have to say. And then, yeah, conclude by showing that the sanctions did not, or only partially achieve their stated goal, and then also, of course, tell us why this is relevant. So a scholar or researcher tries to find either a new answer to an old question, or a new question, or actually a new way of answering a question. A new way of answering a question is like a research that is more focused on methodology and not so much on empirical results. So which one is better? Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to tell you that the researchers or scholars approach is better than that of a journalist. That would be a gross misunderstanding. No, I think this question of who is better cannot be answered, because both journalist and scholar are simply playing different games. It's like comparing apples and oranges. It's not the same thing. And actually, I believe that a good journalist has to be a bit of a scholar, having some structure in his mind in order to approach a topic in a more sophisticated and, how do I say that, regular way, but also vice versa. A good scholar is always also kind of inquisitive, open to new evidence, able to sell his or her results to the audience. You know, we all know these very boring pieces of scholarship where you read one page and then you just stop, right? So what's the whole point? You know, all that work that goes into research and then people just don't read it? No. I think it's quite okay to be a bit more interesting, a bit more open-minded, a bit more flexible in your approach, and yes, be a bit more populistic too. There's nothing wrong about it. The thing is, for you, the answer to which one is better is pretty simple, because you are a student in the EcoS master program. You are supposed to write a term paper and a master's thesis. So for you, in this particular case, you have to be scholars. Don't be journalists. It's not wrong to be a journalist. It's just wrong to be a journalist when you write an EcoS term paper or master's thesis. That's not what I want you to do. Therefore, you are expected to do what a researcher does in our example here. Now, if you think you have never done this before, I would say think again. And I have 3 examples here where I'm trying to prove that you have actually done this before, actually many times. You have 3 economic decisions to make: a bottle of wine for 20 euros, a new smartphone that you want to buy for 1,000 euros, or a new car for 30,000 euros. Well, I guess not many of you have bought a new car for 30,000 euros, but you can at least imagine what it means. It's a huge amount of money, right? So it's a decision that I guess you will really think about a lot. When it comes to this kind of decisions, I'm pretty sure you know 2 types of people. One, that's just a guy who goes to the nearest store, buys that stupid bottle of wine, and that's it. Buys one, perhaps, the first one that he sees, or defines 20 euros as the price range, and, doesn't really think much about it. That's it. Then you have this type 2 person who, first of all, tries to find out whether his friend likes red or white wine, or a heavier wine or a lighter version of it, French wine or Italian wine or New World wine or whatever. Then you would read reviews on wines, trying to find out what is really actually a good wine. You identify maybe 5 wines that come on a short list that fit those criteria, compare prices in different stores. Then you think about buying local wines, out of whatever patriotic considerations or concern for the environment, for example, and so on and so on. Now, for wine, actually, most people, I think, will be more like type 1, or maybe somewhere in between, because there are transaction costs. That's how the economists call this. No action is actually free of any cost, so whatever you do includes transaction costs. And if those transaction costs are higher than the value of the actual, in this case, a bottle of wine, 20 euros, you wouldn't really want to invest that much time. You wouldn't want to spend 2 hours on selecting a bottle of wine, unless you really have lots of time. Now think about the smartphone. What if you have to buy a smartphone? You can actually proceed according to a similar structure. You either go to a store, buy one, go back home, costs you 20 minutes, done. You have your smartphone. Or you actually spend more time. And here I actually think that more of you would actually become more like type 2. And then a car for 30,000 euros, then I'm really certain that most of you will indeed be type 2 people who really, really spend their time trying to make an informed decision about this huge amount of money that you intend to spend. In fact, I think when you bought your last smartphone, it's pretty much what you have done. And what you see here in blue are the components of the basic structure of our term paper and master's thesis. So this is familiar to you. I hope so. So first of all, you ask yourself, what is it that I want and why do I want it? What do I need it for, right? So that's your research question and the relevance of research question. Who can benefit how from knowing the answer to your research question? In that case, it's you will benefit. Question is, how will you benefit, right? Then you would read perhaps reviews online, or you talk to friends who already have smartphones and try to collect information, and maybe you go to an electronics store and talk to people there, and look at this smartphone, look at that smartphone. In any case, you do what we as scholars would call a literature review. So you look at the state of the art, you look at what others have done on your very topic, and you try to benefit from it. You try to stand on the shoulders of giants, as we call it, so that you are a bit taller, right? So you learn from previous experience and try to come up with a better decision, or a decision that was at least equally good, right? Then you assign, you come up with an analytical framework, like a list of characteristics that smartphones would typically have, after you've done all these reviews and discussions, right? and you find out, okay, obviously screen size is a major thing. Is it like 7 inches or 5 inches, you know? Again, 7 inches is quite a lot. Do you really need this? Maybe 5 inches better, it will fit better into your pocket. Or maybe you don't even put your smartphone in your pocket and you need a big screen because you want to watch videos and so on, right? But in any case, screen size matters. Battery life. If you know you're going to charge your smartphone every day, that's fine. If you know you're going to go to the rainforest and will not be able to charge it for 5 days, it might actually be a very relevant criteria, right? Then you have to decide, do I take Android or do I take iOS? You will look at the price. Should it be less or more than 500 euros or something? And, you know, I think I don't have to read all these points here. Since you all have smartphones, you all know what they mean. Then you usually, I'm sure you did that too, assign a value to each of those characteristics. That's also part of the analytical framework. Now, I don't think that you necessarily deliberately assigned a value. I don't think you wrote it down and said, screen size is like 10% of the overall importance, and then battery life maybe is worth 20% for me, etc. But somehow deep inside of you, you have decided which criterion is more important to you than others, etc. And that will also have influenced your decision making. Then, you know, you collect information on available smartphones according to that list of characteristics. Again, not every one of you wrote that down. I would actually do it, being a scholar. That's how I bought my last notebook computer, actually. But I think, again, somewhere in your brain, you have done this anyway. You collect the information and then you compare. That would be the empirical part. This is where you collect information according to a predefined structure. And then finally, you take all these results together, decide on a model, and then look at prices, and then finally go ahead and buy it, right? So that's the analytical part of any term paper or master's thesis. If this indeed applies to you, as I would actually assume, then congratulations. Then you already know what research is. It's nothing new to you. You just have to now transfer that from the personal level to a more structured approach in terms of writing an academic piece of work. If that does not apply to you, then again, congratulations. Then you must be really rich and don't have to care about money, and you just buy the most expensive phone, or you buy a phone, you don't like it, you throw it away and buy a new one. Good for you. But in that case, of course, you will have to relearn really, or to learn from scratch how to have such a systematic approach. But actually, I think most of you are more like people who already know this kind of approach. You might not have been aware of it. Okay, and now ask yourself, coming back to our term paper or master's thesis, is this more like a 20-euro bottle of wine, or is it more like a 30,000 euro car? In other words, how complicated is it? And I would actually say it goes more towards a car rather than a bottle of wine. So as a result, and as kind of a summary from those funny examples, I thought they are funny. Hope you thought that too. From those examples then, this is the basic structure of all term papers and master's theses. You have a theoretical part, you have an empirical part, and you have an analytical part. And the theoretical part consists of an introduction, a literature review, and an analytical framework. The introduction is where you state your topic and explain your choice, why you decided for this topic. Usually you're asked to keep this short. Then you pose your research question and also explain why it matters and to whom. In your literature review or state of the art, you show that you know what others have written on your topic. You demonstrate how others tried to answer your research question or a related research question, and identify controversies, debates, schools, and so on and so on. In the analytical framework, this is basically a roadmap of how you want to answer your question. It should be based on the literature review. You need to explain all of your selected criteria and then also have a table summarizing this set of criteria, etc. Don't worry, we will go through all these pieces step by step in later presentations. This is just now the one overview thing. I will spend much more time trying to explain in a more transparent way to you what you are expected, so that you have a very good idea of what you need to do. And yeah, well, you see it on the slide here. In the empirical part, you apply your framework, collect data, and in the analytical part, you basically answer your research question and also discuss why this is relevant, what it means, and so on and so on. Do you have to structure all your research like this? That was a question where I said it's difficult to answer. The answer is yes and no. Well, yes, of course, because you do need a relevant question. You need to think about how to answer that question. You need to do so based on what has been done before, unless you really want to waste your time and energy. You have to apply this approach because that's the whole point of this approach, right? And then, of course, you have to ask yourself what all this has been good for. So yes, of course, I would say from that perspective, it's crystal clear. That's exactly the structure you have to apply. Secondly, and as I already mentioned, you've done this anyway throughout most of your life. So what's the big deal? And then finally, in a very pragmatic way to answer this question, yes, because you're supposed to do this. You're here at EcoS, and that's exactly what we require you to do, whether you like it or not. Yeah, but there are also a few no's here. No, because often this structure will be more of a hidden rationale behind something that looks much less complicated or even easy and obvious. I think you don't really have to go step by step through all these stages if you understand the principle, if you apply this in a more natural way. If you read academic publications with this in mind, you will sometimes have to look really closely before you can actually identify all those components. And this is not because these other scholars, they don't know how to do research. It's because they integrate this into a text that flows more like one big piece of work rather than really being so although almost mathematically structured, right? And the other no is because sometimes empirical work or questions about causalities, which I usually discourage you from doing in your term papers and master's thesis, and also speculations about the future, which you also ought not to do in EcoS, are of a high value. I mean, these are the most interesting questions, aren't they? Like, what's going to happen in China 5 years from now? Or how is the coronavirus pandemic going to change the world, right? Or how long is the regime in North Korea going to last? Or how will Korean unification proceed? Or how will Japan deal with aging? Or will there be a unification between China and Taiwan? Or will Taiwan become independent? This is future and speculative, and it's exciting. And it would be so stupid if you would not ask these questions. So please do. Never let anyone take away your curiosity, your wanting to know more, as I wrote here on the slide. The thing is that this is not what you're supposed to do as part of your term paper and master's thesis. This is the only problem that we have here. But otherwise, oh my God, please keep doing that. Keep asking these questions. So look at this approach as one way of approaching the unknown, one way out of many, as a tool that's in your toolkit. So you can take it and use it, or just leave it where it is for the time being, to bring some order into the chaos of your thoughts. Sometimes this is very useful, especially if your thoughts are chaotic because there's so much that you're thinking about and you don't really know where to move. And also as a kind of a guideline to deal with a large number of facts that you find yourself surrounded with. So, one way of approaching things and a tool in your toolkit. Well, this is it. You see here a list of more videos. That was just the first in a whole series of videos where I'm trying to explain to you what research is and also how your research will be graded. So, for example, topic and research question, relevance, literature review, analytical framework, empirical analytical part, other criteria, formal aspects of term papers. This is something that will also determine how your work will be graded here at EcoS, term papers and master's thesis. So I'm going to discuss this in more detail. Then I will have a few special issues to talk about, like what is a hypothesis? It's one of these terms that students very often use in a wrong way, so I will try to correct that. I will also list a few commonly made mistakes, just listing some experience from the past and hoping that you will then avoid those mistakes. And there will be a few more, and you're also welcome whenever you encounter a topic related to this where I think, hey, I would like to know more about it, let me know, and I'm happy to produce another of these videos. Today's one was actually not so short, but I promise the other ones will be much, much briefer. But today, since it was the overview of the whole structure, it was a bit more extensive. Anyway, thank you for your attention. Please use the option of watching this video perhaps twice. This is why I recorded it in the first place, so that you can actually watch it as long as you want. And maybe you can also pause it if it's at some point too much for you. In any case, please try to follow my advice, because that's why I'm making all this effort. I'm really looking forward to reading your term papers and your master's thesis, and I keep my fingers crossed, or my thumbs pressed, as we do in Austria and Germany, that you will actually apply what I just tried to tell you. Anyway, thank you, and see you next time for the next video. Goodbye.